So we spent some time in the book of Hebrews, yes? And I sent you to a lot of different places, and I wanted to get you kind of versed in the whole thing. What is Hebrews trying to show us? Well, it's that Jesus has a better ministry. Better than what? Well, better than a lot of things, right? A lot of things that come out of the Old Testament. Surprise, surprise, right? So, I'm not going to go through each one of them verse by verse, but what is he better than? Well, he's got a better ministry than angels. He's better ministry than Moses. His house, the group of people that he's serving over, is better than Moses' house, right? It's the church, right? He's got a better than Levitical priesthood. It's in the order of Melchizedek. He's a mediator of a better covenant. We talk about what does mediator of a covenant mean. Moses in the Old Testament fulfilled the role of a mediator of a covenant. He went up on the mountain, right? He was in the presence of God, and he got the covenant. And then he brought the covenant out of the top of the mountain, and I'm going to suggest to you that's a symbol of what? Where? Not the top of a mountain, but heaven itself. It's a symbol, right? He goes up and meets God. He's by himself. He gets the covenant. He brings the covenant down to the base of the mountain, which is earth, where the people are, and he gives the covenant to the people. But is that covenant a lasting covenant? No. Was it easy to follow? No. Did they follow? Well, no, they didn't. Okay. Jesus is a better mediator. It's the same story. Jesus is up in heaven with God. He gets the terms of the covenant. He comes down to earth. He shares the covenant with the people. Is it a better one? Yeah, it's better in many ways. His rule will last forever. Jeremiah 31:31 suggests that it is a better covenant because it's not written on stone tablets, but it's written where? On the individual hearts of those who believe, who are members of that covenant, people of faith. He serves in a better temple. He has prepared a better place to be, right? He offers a better sacrifice. It's himself. It's a once and for all, right? And not just the book of Hebrews, but Jesus himself. We went to Matthew chapter 12, and Jesus himself invites us to imagine him as being better than several other shadows in the Old Testament. I'm going to try and tie this together for you in maybe a way that you hadn't pieced together on your own in your own study. There were three positions in the Old Testament that when God identified people to fill the roles of those three positions, they were anointed physically with oil on their head as a symbol of the Holy Spirit's choosing them and empowering them to do the job which they were called to do. Does that make sense? Do we know what positions those were? There were three of them. They were priest, and they were prophet, and they were kings. Okay? Do you know the Hebrew word for anointed one? You do. I don't know if you actually... It's Messiah. And so there were lots of Messiahs in the Old Testament, lowercase m's, right? Lots of Messiahs. All of the Messiahs, people anointed for one of those three positions in the Old Testament, all of them pointed toward a capital M Messiah that would come, one that would fulfill all of the roles better than any of the people before him. So in Matthew chapter 12, we walked you through three something greater than statements. And the first one is something greater than the temple is here. That's in Matthew 12:6. Jesus says, but I say to you, something greater than the temple is here. Well, what does that mean? Well, it definitely means something better than the ministry that happens in the temple. But who's in charge of the ministry of the temple? Well, it's the high priest. It's the whole priestly tribe, right? He's pointing to a temple that's physical structure, a shadow ministry, if you will, right? And he's saying something greater than that ministry is here. And who's he talking about? It's himself. I want you to see that in terms of Jesus saying something greater than all the priests that came before me is here. A better priesthood has arrived. And then we jump down to 1241, something greater than Jonah is here, right? What was the result of Jonah's ministry? He was one of the rare prophets that was called to not the Jewish people, but to the people of Nineveh, a Gentile people. And so it was the result of Jonah's ministry after the whole 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great sea monster event. He goes and the gospel spreads to the Gentiles, and the Gentiles receive the message. Was it a permanent thing? Well, it didn't last more than a generation, if that. Okay, they eventually turned and they got lambasted for it later. Okay, but something greater than Jonah is here. What role does Jonah play in the Old Testament? He's a prophet. So who do we have so far in chapter 12? We have the priestly Messiah role, and we have a prophet Messiah role. And who's left? The next verse, 1242. The queen of the south will rise up and will condemn it because she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. Solomon, the king in the Old Testament, not the best king, but talked about in terms of the wisest, although I would argue that point on some level. But the thing that's characteristic of Solomon's kingdom, more than any other, is the borders of the kingdom were the furthest extent under Solomon's rule than anyone else. Okay? And he built the what? Temple, because he was not a man at war. He didn't have blood on his hands like his father David, which means his kingdom was at rest with his neighbors. And he ruled his kingdom from Jerusalem, where the temple was. Do you see any corollaries here? Things matching up? But it's that character that Jesus pulls out of the Old Testament and says something greater than Solomon is here. And in so doing, he's not just saying Solomon, but he's saying what? Something greater than every king that came before me is here. And in so doing, he's hit the trifecta, which is the Messiah positions of leadership coming out of the Old Testament: prophet, the priest, the prophet, and the king. Jesus has in one chapter made the statement, I'm better than everything that came before me. Stated in different terms, how could you say that differently? The substance of the shadows has arrived. You shouldn't be looking back and thinking that it's in those shadow things, those shadow ministries, that you find the substance. It's not there. Those are flat representations of something that has substance. And in every case, Jesus says, I am that substance. I am better than all the shadows that came before me. So, it finishes with this statement in 12:8, and this is how we'll finish tonight. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And I asked you in the lesson, what do you think that means? And I imagine we've got a couple different answers, possibly, that came out of that. But let me suggest to you what he's not saying. I don't think he's saying that he gets to make the rules about how to observe the weekly day of rest. And that's often where we land coming out of this study. Out of a study of this passage, we often say, because he's Lord of the Sabbath, he then gets to make the rules about what we do on that one day a week that we don't work. Because that's the story that comes before this. And so we might think that, oh, that's his point. He gets to make the rules about how not to work. Well, in a sense, that's true, but let me state it a little differently. I think when he says the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, I think he's saying he is Lord and commander of this idea of rest. Okay? And I think he's saying, I don't just make the rules, I am the creator of rest. It is under my rule and authority that rest occurs. Which is a picture of what? Who's he likening himself to out of the Old Testament? Very God himself, out of the creation of the world, who rested on day 7 and began his rule of an ordered, functional cosmos. And so I think he's saying, I am the one, Jesus, I am the one who brings functionality and rule back to humanity. He is the one that humanity must listen to and follow to enter back into the rest that we lost in the Garden of Eden. It is through Jesus that we find our purpose and our place. And apart from him, we are still working under the curse outside the garden and outside the rest. But what he is inviting us to do is to picture his ministry as an open door into rest. In the next lesson, we will look at more detail at Jesus' ministry of rest. Some of you have already looked over your lesson. We'll be looking largely in the Gospels, but we'll also be looking in select places in the New Testament. It's going to be a good picture of who Jesus is and what he offers.